Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at exam skills. This time we'll be looking at paper 3 with the how far do you agree with the view in the particular interpretation question, which is worth 16 marks. The topic will be Weimar and Nazi Germany. If you've not looked at the other exam skills videos in this series, including the 8-mark source answer and the 2 4-mark interpretations answers, I'll go back and have a look at those first before trying this one out. All of the questions are from the same paper and are on the same sources and interpretations, so doing them in that order will definitely be helpful. Firstly, a bit of a reminder as to how the paper is structured. This generally covers a modern depth study. An example of such a study is Weimar and Nazi Germany 1918 to 1939, and that'll be the focus of this particular exam skills lesson. I've also got exam skills lessons on the Vietnam War and civil rights as well. This particular topic comprises Weimar Germany 1918 to 1933 and then Nazi Germany 1933 to 1939. Other topics are similarly organised. You will answer questions on sources, your knowledge and on interpretations. Therefore, there is a separate sources and interpretations sheet or booklet that's included with this exam. You'll have an hour and 20 minutes to do this, or possibly slightly longer if you're going to be doing the exams from 2025 onwards. That's for both of the sections within this paper. So let's get into it. There's a lot going on in this question, so it's going to be worth our while spending some time really pulling it apart. This question is assessing your analysis and evaluation of interpretations, which is assessment objective 4 and should take you about 25 minutes. You'll need to use your own knowledge to provide context, so although you won't be directly marked for that, if you haven't got any, you will struggle here. You will need to ensure that you use the correct interpretations. You'll also be judged upon your spelling, punctuation and grammar and use of specialist terminology, which will be worth 4 additional marks. You'll need to relate your answer to the inquiry, which here is the reasons why Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, and that's been a running theme throughout all the questions in this section. You could use sources B and C in this question where relevant, but this is not required. If you are unlucky and you are stuck for knowledge, these do provide some handy reminders though, but I'm sure you won't find yourself in that situation if you've been watching this series. Take care with the spelling, punctuation and grammar though. Taking time to proofread and correct your answer can earn you a valuable extra 4 marks, and it would be a real shame to miss out on a grade just because you made a few spelling mistakes. Bear in mind as well that you will need to use both interpretations and your knowledge to get full marks here. And remember, you're meant to give a judgment. How far do you agree with interpretation 2? Well, you can't know how far you agree with interpretation 2 until you've studied the interpretations. So we're going to do a recap of those interpretations and the sources before we get into writing this answer. This is an extract from the mark scheme as to how this question was marked back in June 2022. Compare some of the key features. To get level 3, which is still a pretty good mark, the answer provides an explained evaluation, agreeing or disagreeing with interpretation 2. Notice it says agreeing or disagreeing, whereas actually you'll give both sides of the points of view in level 4. You'll have given a good analysis of the interpretations, showing a difference of view and deploying this to support the evaluation for level 3. Improve upon that though for level 4. Precise analysis of interpretations is shown, indicating how the differences of view are conveyed in deploying this material to support the evaluation. Alright, that's quite a mouthful of a sentence there, but what it really means is you're using really precise knowledge and really precise parts of the interpretation to show why you agree with a particular view and why the other one might be less agreeable. Then the knowledge section. Knowledge is used to directly support the evaluation, and overall judgment is given with some justification, and a line of reasoning is generally sustained, so you don't just change your mind on your opinion halfway through. But you're a little bit more laser precise with the level 4 section. Relevant contextual knowledge is precisely selected, so you've used the very best supporting examples to support the evaluation. An overall judgment is justified, and the line of reasoning is coherent, sustained and logically structured. So you haven't just said what your opinion is and tried to back it up, you've really explained it and put it to the test. Let's remind ourselves what the interpretations and sources were with this question. Here's that question again. How far do you agree with interpretation 2 about the reasons why Hitler became Chancellor in 1933? In the first of the interpretations answers, the first full marker, usually question B, you will have already done this. You'll have identified what the views are, so this shouldn't take you too much additional time. But just in case you've not done that first by watching the earlier videos, here's a summary. This is interpretation 1, from Hitler's 30 Days to Power by H.A. Turner, published in 1996. And here is interpretation 2, from Hitler by Ian Kershaw, published in 1991. Alright, well let's focus on interpretation 2 first. What is the view of this interpretation? So this is the bit that we're going to try and agree with. It seems that Kershaw is claiming that mass support gave Hitler a key to unlocking the door to power. You might have chosen a different part of the source to justify here, but that's the gist of it. So we're having to decide, do we agree with that? Well, do we agree with that in comparison to what interpretation 1 is saying? Which is saying that it wasn't about mass support. Hitler was actually handed power by the people who controlled Germany. In this case, that's Hindenburg and von Papen. So, do you agree with interpretation 1, or do you agree with interpretation 2? You can decide now, and that will help shape your answer. The sources may be used, but they won't be essential. They are going to be relevant though, so especially if you're a little bit patchy on your knowledge, it's worth bearing them in mind. This is source B, from Inside the Third Reich, an autobiography of Albert Speer. The source, if you want to read the whole thing, is related to Speer experiencing some of Hitler's speeches and how popular he was, suggesting that it was his popularity that got him lots of electoral support and therefore put pressure on Hindenburg and von Papen to make him chancellor. On the other hand, source C is from the diary of Joachim von Ribbentrop, and here Ribbentrop is claiming that it's the behind-the-scenes dealings between von Papen and Hindenburg which handed Hitler the chancellorship. You can read these sources in full if you want to by pausing the video now, but I'm going to assume that you've seen the earlier videos and you've got some sort of familiarity with them. Here we should be able to see that source B supports interpretation 2 and source C supports interpretation 1. So source B supports interpretation 2 because it's saying that it's all about the electoral support, and source C supports interpretation 1 because it's all about the backroom dealings between von Papen and Hindenburg. So how do you go about putting this answer down on paper? I'll be using this structure for my paragraphs, making a point, giving an example, explaining it, and then linking it back to the questions. At various points, I may also evaluate parts of my answer as well to show alternative points of view, but the fact that they might be weaker than other points of view. We'll come to that when it becomes more obvious. So let's start with my first point, and here I should be giving an indication as to what interpretation 2 is saying. Because the question mentions interpretation 2, I'm going to start with interpretation 2 as well. In some ways, interpretation 2 may be correct about the reasons why Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, as the Nazis' popularity and success in the 1932 elections destabilised the Reichstag and put huge pressure on Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as Chancellor. This interpretation says that Hitler had mass support, partly due to his speeches and campaigning in 1932. Hitler visited many parts of the country, seeking support in the elections. It worked. In the July 1932 election, the Nazis got 38% of the vote and won 230 seats. Though they lost some of the seats in November, they remained the largest party in the Reichstag. This caused von Papen to lose control of the Reichstag. When Hindenburg appointed Schleicher, he did no better, threatening a military coup to keep the Nazis out of power. This put pressure on Hindenburg to appoint Hitler. I largely agree with this view. Hindenburg was forced to appoint Hitler as Chancellor as he had little other option. The Nazis' success in the 1932 elections put massive pressure on him to appoint the leader of the biggest party in the Reichstag, as the Nazis had helped cause both Papen and Schleicher's failures. So let's break down this first paragraph a little bit. We could actually add more to this. Adding further examples and further explanation can be helpful, but I think this probably would be about the minimum detail you could get away with and still get full marks. So again, to be safe, you might want to add more. I'm also mindful of the fact that I've got a lot of text on the screen, so I'm going to leave it as it is. You'll notice as well I've not really done an introduction. It is possible to say what your view is on interpretation 2 right at the start, but that's a little bit of a risk. If you change your mind halfway through, you'll have to remember to go back and correct it, and that can complicate matters. But if you are confident, stick it in there because those are marks right away for giving a very clear argument and judgment. So I'll get some marks for identifying what interpretation 2 is saying, adding my own knowledge and explanation to that, and then most crucially, linking it back to the question, saying whether I agree or disagree. And in terms of the how far element, I largely agree with this view. It means not entirely, but more agree than disagree. We now need to give the same treatment to interpretation 1 though. I'm going to use the same structure again. In other ways, interpretation 1 may be correct about the reasons why Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, as the actions of von Papen and Hindenburg were important to making Hitler Chancellor. The interpretation says that Hitler was handed the chancellorship by von Papen and Hindenburg at a time when support for the Nazis was declining, as they had lost seats in the November election. This is a valid view, as Hindenburg had long tried to avoid appointing Hitler as Chancellor, first appointing von Papen and then Schleicher. However, both of them had failed to secure the support of the Reichstag. As the Nazis were the biggest party, even after the losses in November, von Papen persuaded Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as Chancellor and himself as Vice-Chancellor. I partly agree with this view. Both Hindenburg and von Papen had expected to be able to control Hitler. However, the reason they felt forced to appoint him was because Hitler had led the biggest party in the Reichstag as a result of the Nazis' election success, which better supports interpretation 2. So how have I done here? Well, again, I've made a relevant point about interpretation 1, so I've used both of the interpretations as the question demands. I've added my own knowledge and some explanation to that as well. And I've linked it back to the question, saying that I do partly agree with this view. But then I've added the evaluation. Here I'm linking it back to my original argument that I more agree with interpretation 2. So when it comes to answering how far do you agree with interpretation 2, well, I can sort of see the point of interpretation 1, but I still more agree with interpretation 2. I've not yet fully justified that though. I'm going to need a third section and a conclusion to do that. So let's get into the conclusion now. Overall, I largely agree with interpretation 2 that mass support was the reason for Hitler becoming Chancellor. So my point here is consistent with what else I've written. Interpretation 2 shows that it was the massive success of the Nazis in the elections of 1932 that made the difference. While interpretation 1 points out that Nazi support appeared to be falling, they were still by far the biggest party with 190 seats. The failure of both von Papen and Schleicher to rule democratically, instead relying on Article 48 of the Constitution, shows that the only way Hindenburg could avoid appointing Hitler was by also ignoring the democratic nature of the Weimar Constitution. There was nobody else obvious who could be appointed. This makes me agree with interpretation 2 because Hindenburg was forced into this situation by Nazi popularity and would have been unlikely to choose Hitler without their success in elections. While it is true that Hindenburg and von Papen appointed Hitler expecting to control him, I disagree that this was the most important reason, as they only gambled on this deal because Nazi popularity forced them to. So there we are. I've compared the two views and explained fully why I more agree with interpretation 2 than other views. In terms of structure, this is like a lot of the other 16-mark answers that you might have done for paper 1 and paper 2. But here we're not just using our own knowledge, we're referring to and arguing between the two interpretations. So I've made a relevant point in my conclusion, given supporting examples from both interpretations, explained them, linked it back to the question and evaluated. So far, so good. Now let's consider what not to do. I'm not going to write anything that's factually inaccurate here, but let's see if you can spot the mistake I've made. The most important reason Hitler was appointed as Chancellor in 1933 was the effects of the Wall Street crash. This caused an economic crisis in Germany, with unemployment soaring to over 4 million by 1933. It also resulted in the failure of Brüning's government and repeated elections in 1932. Economic hardship had caused the German people to lose faith in mainstream parties, resulting in success for the Nazis in the elections of 1932. After the July election, the Nazis were the biggest party in the Reichstag, with 38% of the vote. This made it impossible for first von Papen and then von Schleicher to rule. This makes the Wall Street crash the most important reason Hitler became Chancellor, as it was dissatisfaction with the Weimar government's handling of the German economy that eventually made them vote for the Nazis. This in turn forced Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as Chancellor in January the 30th, 1933. Well, what is the problem here? Doesn't this look like an accurate answer? The trouble here is if this was a 16-mark answer that was simply asking me about my knowledge, I probably would have done pretty well. Unfortunately for me, it's not. It's asking me about the two interpretations. And this judgment has nothing to do with either interpretation, which doesn't even mention the Wall Street crash. Therefore, this explanation and the own knowledge has nothing to do with the interpretations either, which makes my judgment worthless as well. That's a real shame, because clearly if someone wrote this in this much detail, they've got a really good knowledge of the topic, but it simply wouldn't be credited. This question is asking you to test these two interpretations using your own knowledge, comparing them and deciding which interpretation you more agree with, not what your interpretation would be if you were writing your own history book. So be really careful about that. If you're used to writing 16-mark answers just based upon your own knowledge, this is a really easy trap to fall into, and you've got to make sure that you don't. Our final points then. The 16-mark interpretations question is challenging. In fact, my students often find it the hardest of the lot. But in its structure, it is similar to the knowledge-based essay-style answers. You'll need to identify what the specified interpretations view is. This is made easier by doing the 2 4-mark questions first, so you'll have already done that heavy lifting. You will need to be clear on how far you agree with this view. Largely, to an extent, to a small extent, what is it? You will need to compare the views, considering how both may be valid. This is done by using your own knowledge and/or the sources. But you must address the interpretations, or you risk scoring 0. All marks are for AO4, the analysis of interpretations. Remember to reread your answers to maximise your chances of getting the 4 additional marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar, and the use of specialist terminology. I didn't notice any typos of mine. I wonder how I would have done. But once you've done that, then congratulations, your History GCSE is over. You've done paper 1, you've done paper 2, and you've done paper 3. Breathe a sigh of relief, and I'll see you on results day. That's also the end on this rather long series on Weimar and Nazi Germany. I really hope it's been useful to you, and you can now help me out if you like, and I'd really appreciate it if you could. Many of these videos, because of their content, are not possible to monetize or promote, but they've taken me a long time to produce. This is not actually something I teach at my own school, so I've done this really to help you guys out of the goodness of your own heart. Well, at least I like to think that's what I've done anyway. So if you can do me a favour and like as many videos as you can, share them with your friends, tell people about them, and also subscribe to the channel, it would be hugely appreciated. Not least because I would say about 1/3 of these particular videos have been demonetised, or I've not been able to monetise them at all, and that's perfectly understandable. This is not the sort of content that advertisers want to be associated with, and I can't do anything about it. But the alternative is making content which is historically inaccurate, censors things, or leaves out really important things that you guys need to know. And that would be incredibly pointless to do. So I've taken the hit and I've made it accurate and hopefully as helpful as possible. So again, thanks very much for watching if you've watched this far. And if you can help me out in any of the ways I've mentioned, I'll be really grateful. Good luck in the exam. And once it's all over, I'd love to hear how you've done. Goodbye for now.